Are you seeing?
Yes, we are. You can go ahead.
Yeah, put this. It's what I put this in. Where is Sarah? Oh, never mind. I figured it out. So Brianna can read it.
Everyone in the group participated.
Uh, I'm not sure.
Yes or no, because it's graded, so I need to know if they should get the full 20
Yes,
or
sir.
everybody participated.
Yes.
Don't tell any lie.
Sir is not lying.
Okay. Go ahead.
Who's reading? Hmm.
Okay, good morning, everybody. This is our presentation on William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, and Granville Sharp.
What? Oh, oh, so yeah, no, yeah.
So, the Emancipation Movement in Britain. This started in the 18th century, around the mid 18th century to be more exact, and it was a period in Britain where there was a massive increase in anti slavery movements.
You're reading, Brianna?
Brenna, look like her internet go off. Just go ahead for me, Austin. Just run through it for me,
Who
please.
is William Wilberforce? Wilberforce was a member of parliament who could introduce the abolition issue, who introduced the abolition issue into debates in the House of Commons. He entered the House of Commons as a member for the Hull in 1780 at only 21 years of age. He was also a member of the Society for Effecting the Abolition of Slavery. In 1787, he was appointed by Thomas Clarkson to take up the cause of abolition and held abolitionist society meetings at his home in London. Who is Thomas Clarkson? Thomas Clarkson was born on March 28, 1760, Wisbech, Cambridgeshire, England. He died on September 26, 1846. As an abolitionist, he was one of the first effective publicists of the English movement against the slave trade and against slavery in the colonies. Clarkson was ordained a deacon, but from 1785 he devoted his life to abolitionism. His an essay on the slavery on commerce of the human species, 1786, brought him into association with Granville Sharp, William Wilberforce, and other foes of slavery. Clarkson visited British ports to collect facts for his pamphlet, A Some Review of the Slave Trade and of the probable consequences of its abolition in 1787. The evidence that he gathered was used in the anti-slavery campaign led by Wilberforce in Parliament. Who was Granville Sharp? Granville Sharp was a civil servant and political reformer. He was one of the 12 men who, in 1787, formed the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. He was the chairman of the society. Granville Sharp was the first individual in the society to take up cause of the slaves. In 1765, Sharp stumbled upon a badly beaten and abandoned enslaved Jonathan Strong. He took this case to court but was not successful. The opportunity came again when he took another case to court, this time for an enslaved called James Somerset, who was abandoned by his master also. What was Granville Sharp's contribution to the emancipation movement in Britain? Granville Sharp was the one that took the James Somerset case to court, in which Lord Mansfield was prompted to distribute a ruling. He researched every law book, and there was not one rule that slavery was legal in Britain. Mansfield took this matter to Parliament and told them that the slave laws were only applicable to the British Caribbean. They refused to pass a law, so Mansfield issued a judgment that slavery was illegal in Britain because there was no law to support it. Hence, the Registry Bill was passed in Britain in 1815. Roles and contributions of the anti-slavery groups. Roles. Their roles were to end the inhumane treatment of the Africans, to bring awareness to the people of Britain about slavery. Contributions. They made great contributions towards the abolition of the slave trade. Some of the arguments against, huh?
Okay.
Oh,
Okay. Some of the arguments against slavery. It held back the development of Britain's manufacturing industry. At such a time in Britain where capital was heavily needed for industrialists, there was a strain in the funds because of all the mishaps and damage taking place on the plantations, such as, the revolts and the burning down, etc. It was morally wrong. It was morally wrong for Christians to traffic or keep slaves. Freedom is the true natural state of man. Roles of the pro-slavery group: to provide support for the planters in the time of uncertainty, the potential loss of their livelihood, to hold on to slavery and stall the abolition. Bernard can go now.
Some arguments for slavery, and this is for the pro-slavery group. One of such were the Africans were inferior to them, and they justified this by using scriptures from the Bible. And the planters often used the doctrine of obedience by saying that as a subject owed obedience to his king, a child owed obedience to their father, and a slave owed obedience to his master. Also, the white power would be stripped away from them working in the colonies, especially for the poor whites. This idea came as a big issue for them to not support the end of slavery. They were committed to slavery and were racially superior to the blacks, making them have a higher status on the hierarchy of the plantation. Whereas in Britain, when many of them were unemployed, being a planter or working in the Caribbean was seen as a great opportunity for them to gain success.
so some of the concepts that were seen throughout this presentation was William Wilberforce's contribution, Granville Sharp's contribution, and Thomas Clarkson's contribution. Wilberforce's contribution was that he worked in the House of Commons and he spoke regularly on the abolition of the slave trade. Thomas Clarkson's contribution was that he visited trading ports, examined the equipment used, and gathered evidence which he could use against the trade. He also made an essay and a pamphlet. He worked extensively with the anti-slavery campaign, and Granville Sharp's contribution was that he was one of the first individuals to take up cause of the slaves. He made several cases to court on behalf of the enslaved he encountered. He fought against slavery and caused slavery to be ruled illegal in England and continued to fight against this system in the Caribbean. And this is the end of our presentation.
All right, very good. What I want to ask one question for this group. What is the House of Commons? Any member of
Sir,
the group?
it's like
Yes?
the House of Parliament cannot, at
Yes,
the
very good, very
Good.
good. It is the same thing as the House of Parliament, right? They call it the House of Commons, where the
yes, sir.
where the elected members actually sit and have debates. Very good, very good. Next group, which is group number 2, sorry, N, which is Bartley, Bud, Curry, Iron, White. Go ahead for me, ladies. Very good presentation, group number 1.
Good morning, everyone. This is Group 2. We're doing the Metropolitan Movement. The members are Karen Bartley, Gillian Budd, Ashley Curry, Kristen Arns, and Naisha White. The key personalities we'll be looking at today are Thomas Buxton, William Cowper, and William Knipp.
Thomas Buxton. Who was Thomas F. Buxton? Sir Thomas Fowell Buxton, 1st Baronet, was an English Member of Parliament, brewer, abolitionist, and social reformer. Thomas was a philanthropic Member of Parliament who joined the humanitarian opposition to slavery. He first made his name known in calls for improvement in town living conditions and the treatment of prisoners. Buxton became the chief parliamentary spokesman for abolition after William Wilberforce, who became frail with old age and had died. A monument to Thomas Fowell Buxton stands in Westminster Abbey, a memorial to the emancipation of slaves dedicated to Buxton was installed in Victoria Tower Gardens. Commissioned by his son Charles Buxton, MP, the Buxton Memorial Fountain was designed by Samuel Saunders Toulon and installed in Parliament Square. Buxton was elected as a Member of Parliament of for Weymouth and Melcombe Regis in 1880. He helped found the Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery, later called the Anti-Slavery Society, in 1823. He took over as leader of the abolition movement in the House of Commons after William Wilberforce retired in 1837. In 18 asked Parliament to make treaties with leaders of the I'm sorry, sir.
Is it White or Bartley? Which one of you? I think your internet is giving a little issue.
The Wi-Fi is giving a bit of.
understand. Who is it? Who is it
Okay.
presented?
His efforts paid off in 1833 when slavery was officially abolished in the United Kingdom. Boston Ed held his seat in Parliament until 1837. In 1839,
Okay, so she looked like her wife had died. So in 1839, Buxton urged the British government to make treaties with African leaders to abolish the slave trade. Buxton moved that society petition Parliament to grant universal emancipation to slave children born on a certain date. Buxton then moved that since Parliament had not acted on the 1823 motion and the West Indian planters had repeatedly thwarted any attempt at abolition, then that the society then declared anew its unalterable determination to leave no proper and practicable means unattempted for effecting at earliest period slavery's entire abolition throughout the British domain. On March 29, 1831, Buxton presented the House 499 petitions from various locations in England. Quakers, Buxton continued, introduced the first petitions for abolition of the slave trade 40 years earlier, and the first calling for the abolition of slavery itself a decade ago. Buxton argued that slavery was morally offensive. He reiterated that the decreases in population. Buxton also presented accounts of cruelties inflicted on slaves, focusing on the use of whip as punishment. He noted that this type of barbarity would not go unchecked. Thomas Fowell Buxton died North Reps Hall, Norfolk, on 19th of February 1845, and was buried in the ruined chancel of Overstrand Church. With, or, with ordinary talent and extraordinary perseverance, all things are attainable. Thomas Fowell Buxton. William Cowper. Who was William Cowper? He was the first child of the Reverend John Cowper and Annie Dawn Cowper. Cowper was a renowned 18th century poet and translator of Homer, influenced by his friend John Newton, an anti-slavery campaigner, to write for the abolition campaign. His most influential poem, The Negro's Complaint, was quoted by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. He wrote several anti-slavery poems such as The Negro's Complaint in 1788, A Morning Dream, 1788, and Sweet Meat Has Sour Sauce. The Slave Trader in the Dumps, written in 1788, however published in 1836. He then moved to Westminster School in London and in 1750 began to study law. He was called to the bar in 1754 and took chambers in London, Middlesbrough in 1757. Cowper is considered one of the best writers in English, and some of his hymns, such as God Moves in a Mysterious Way and Oh for a Closer Walk with God, have become part of the folk heritage of Protestant England. Cowper's immense popularity owed much to his advocacy of religious and humanitarian ideals at a time of widespread evangelical sentiment, manifests as much as the moral zeal of anti-slavery movement, which he fervently supported as a tide of spiritual enthusiasm issuing directly from the Great Revival. This is one of his poems entitled The Negro's Complaint. This is also another one of his poems entitled The Morning Dream. William Knibb. William Knibb, who received the Order of Merit in Jamaica, was an English Baptist minister and missionary to Jamaica. He is chiefly known today for his work to free slaves. He dedicated himself fully to God in the year 1822.
He successfully convinced the Baptist Missionary Society, BMS, to allow him to go to Jamaica. When he arrived, he taught at mission schools and preached in many places without a license. However, he soon got a full pastoral in Falmouth. William hated slavery. Even so, the BMS relied heavily upon the hospitality and goodwill of the plantation owner. Consequently, they could not openly support emancipation. So the missionaries were instructed not to interfere with civil and political affairs. Nib, through his preaching, made several enemies among the planters, merchants, traders, whose occupation relied solely and dependently on slavery and the slave trade. Following this, he was also accused of starting several slave revolts, however, which wasn't the case. He advocated that slaves were not to use violent means for freedom, or anyone else for that matter. He was slandered by several newspapers for his ideals, for example, the John Bull newspaper. Nib's determination, however, convinced the BMS that slavery had to be abolished. He argued that until its abolition, the root and branch, there was no way that slaves would enjoy everything that the gospel had to offer. Persons of religious and evangelical movements in Britain were infuriated by the missionaries and slave treatment from the planters. And so Nib and Burchell returned to Britain and brought a first-hand account of the atrocities committed by the Colonial Church Union and the planters on the slaves. The public was convinced that the planters had no hope of change, so it was crucial that the government end it as soon as possible. He also spoke in front of densely packed crowds of the Friends of Christian Missionaries about the abolition of slavery and how the slaves were treated. He set out all over Britain to preach to the masses on the repugnance of slavery. His speeches to the audience were regularly printed in pamphlet form and reported in local or national newspapers, reaching thousands of electors. Pressure from him and others also trimmed apprenticeship down to the period of 4 years. So now we move on to the organized campaign for slavery. One such campaign was the West India Interest, and this was made up of planters, merchants, and other people who were interested in the West India. The West India interest was a growing force in British politics, and some West Indians or Englishmen with plantations in the West Indies were members of Parliament. Others could control the votes in the House of Commons through the system of patronage, which existed in British politics in the 18th century. For 200 years, supporters of the slave trade were successful in their opposition as that was their role. The lobby won major concessions from the British government and proved tough opposition to the abolitionists. The West Indian interests were among many other pro-slavery groups. What were some of the arguments made by the organized campaigns for slavery? One such is that taking Africans from their homeland benefited them. They argued that African societies and cultures were unskilled, they were uneducated, they were savage. For example, Michael Renwick, who was a sergeant, he's a merchant from Liverpool, he claimed that we ought to consider whether Negroes in a well-regulated plantation under the protection of a kind master do not enjoy as great, nay, even greater advantages than when under their own despotic governments. In his publication, The History of the British West Indies, that was published in 1819, Mr. Edwards also uses this argument when he describes a woman who said she preferred Jamaica to Guinea, as people, Guinea, as people were not killed there. Another argument is that slavery was accepted in the Bible. They used the Bible to justify slavery. The pro-slavery supporters suggested that the slave trade was tolerable and it was approved by God in the days of Abraham. In a book by an unknown author, The Negro and the Free-Born Briton Compared, or A Vindication of the African Slave Trade, 1790. The author argued that slavery was lawful, right, from a religious, political, and commercial view. Another argument is that the enslaved people were not ill-treated unless they were rebellious. So conditions on the slave ships were acceptable in those times, right? Several of those involved in the trade, merchants, ship captains, planting owners, they all provided evidence to Parliament regarding this, right? And one example is the report of Mr. Norris to the Privy Council in 1789. The enslaved people were unfitting for work. Many people were very prejudiced in their beliefs. Many ordinary people in Britain were very uneducated and they traveled little further than their own village, making it easier. So it's easier for them to say, it's easier for those who are involved in the trade to influence the public opinion because they really don't know what is going on, right? Another argument is that if Britain didn't engage in the trade, then others would. One man's garbage is another man's treasure. If Britain ceased to trade in slaves with Africa, their commercial rivals, French and the Dutch, would soon fill the gap, right? I said, move along, move up, and the Africans would be in a much worse situation. This was an argument that was actually used in a speech in Parliament, in 1777. Africa was already involved in slavery. They stated that Africans enslaved each other. Indeed, Britain was engaged in a moral trade because they were helping people. They captured Africans in war who were otherwise could have been executed. Right? They also stated that trade was necessary to the success and wealth of Britain. The merchants and planters, they warned that, guess what? If the slave trade was abolished, the economy of Britain would collapse. Everything done, boom, bang, penny, done. This argument was put forward many times, and for example, in 1749, when a pamphlet was written outlining these arguments. Now, as with every evil, we have good. And these were the organized campaigns against slavery. These were the Quakers, which was a religious sect that included persons such as Thomas Buxton, as the group before stated, Thomas Clarkson, Granville Sharp, William Wilberforce. The Quakers were against slavery and sought to end it. You have the Society for Effecting the Abolition of Slave Trade was also against the slave trade, right? The society's aim was to convince the parliament to pass a law abolishing the slave trade, figuring that slavery would dry up with no more slaves. Who is going to work the labor? And if you don't have anybody to work, then it's going to end. Right? Even after the laws was passed, William Wilberforce continued to protest for slaves, eventually being succeeded by Thomas Buxton. He had the London Society for Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery, which campaigned for full emancipation of all slaves, right? There were 220 branches opened within Britain, and they sent 750 petitions to court. Here are some of the names of some persons who were involved in the London Society for Mitigation and the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. What are the arguments made by these people? They stated, guess what? If something is wrong, it is wrong, whether others do it or not, point blank, period. The anti-slavery supporters, argued that just because other countries engaged in the slave trade, this did not provide a valid reason for Britain to also participate, even if you were making money. This argument was used by Baron Grenville in his speech to the House of the Lords when he said, and I quote, "Can there be a question that the character of the country ought to be cleared from the stain impressed by the guilt for such traffic?" This argument was also cleverly countered in William Cowper's poem, A Pity for Poor Africans. And I urge you all to read that poem. It's a very good poem. It was morally wrong. And as a Christian country with strong Christian belief, Britain should not be involved. The Anti-Slavery Society used the Bible to back up their arguments, right? They pointed to biblical texts like, for example, Luke 16, verse 13, "No man can serve two masters." In answer to the claims, the pro-slavery lobby, Granville Sharp, for example, wrote in his wrote in his pamphlet that the just limitations of slavery in the laws of God, if we can carefully examine these scriptures, we shall find that slavery and oppression was ever abominable in the sight of God. I must excuse you that pro-slavery should have been anti-slavery. Please excuse me. The Africans suffered greatly from being removed from their homelands. They all collected evidence to show that many resisted or preferred death to transportation. Many more died on the voyage to the Caribbean. You can imagine that? You prefer to dead than leave due to how bad the conditions are. Conditions on the ships were deplorable, as was illustrated, and the speech made by Wilberforce to the Parliament in 1789, as well as from the testimony from people like ship's doctors, for example, James Ramsey. The replacement rate statistics also showed that the appalling low life expectancy on the plantations. Trade was damaging to Africa. William Wilberforce summed this up in his speech of 1789. He says, and I quote, "Does anyone suppose that slave trade will help their civilization? It is not plain that she must suffer from it. Does not everyone see that a slave trade carried on around her coast must carry violence and desolation to her very center? Does the king of Barbados want brandy? He has only to send his troops in nighttime to burn and desolate a village. The captives will serve as commodities that may be bartered with British trader." The African people were in no way inferior and should be treated as equals. The Quaker teacher, Anthony Benezet, was always horrified at the suggestion that Africans were in any way inferior. He claimed his experience gained for 20 years teaching Black pupils proved that this was not the case. However, it was the books of and speeches of African writers of the time, such as Olaudah Equiano, who we know, that had the greatest impact in dispelling such misconceptions. Even some of those involved in the slave trade were willing to admit that racist views were wrong. Right? You have there were alternatives to the slave trade. The slavery that existed in Africa was very different from the transatlantic slave trade, right? We know that in Africa, people were normally kept as prisoners of war or victims of political and judicial punishment. However, the slavery did not extend into future generations. Right, now we have a historic timeline. It's a little summary type thing. So in 1787, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of Slave Trade was established. This is where everything began. We know that in December 1807, the slave trade was then abolished. And then in 1823, the Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery was founded. In 1832, we moved now to in Reform Parliament, the representative voted for emancipation as they should. And in 1833, the Emancipation Bill is passed. Couple years down the line, 1830, after much pleading and carrying of evidence, in 1838, abolition of slavery in the British West Indies. What are the key takeaways from this presentation? Thomas F. Buxton, he helped found the Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery. In 1839, Buxton urged the British government to make treaties with African leaders to abolish the slave trade. William Cowper, he was a renowned 18th century poet and a translator of Homer. He wrote several anti-slavery poems, such as The Negroes Complain, The Morning Dream, Sweet Meat Has Sour Sauce, and The Slave Trader in the Dumps. William Knibb was an English Baptist minister and a missionary to Jamaica. He is chiefly known today for his work to free slaves. And because of Knibb's determination, he was able to convince the BMS, which is the Baptist Missionary Society, that slavery had to be abolished. Now, this is the end of our presentation. Thank you very much for participating and listening.
All right, thank you very much. Good presentation. Banton Nelson, Husband Smith.
So I remember asked you to share the
Okay.
presentation.
All right. In the meanwhile, all right. May I go to Beckford, Blake, Cummins? Those members are not here.
Sir, one of the group members is asking if you can just give us a second because she found something else that she think would be beneficial to the class and the
No, the
presentation.
presentation need to go on now. Time is against us. Archer Myers Thorpe,
Yes, sir.
go ahead for me and share screen.
Okay. The Clapham sect and the Society for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. 11E, Carol Thorpe, Calicia Archer, and Paula Ann Myers. The Clapham sect was a group of evangelical. Let me slow down. Clapham sect is a group of evangelical Christians prominent in England from about 1790 to 1830, who campaigned for the abolition of slavery and promoted missionary work at home and abroad. The term Clapham sect was a later invention by James Stephen in an article of 1844, which would celebrated and romanticized the work of these reformers.
The members of the Claphams group were chiefly prominent and wealthy evangelical Anglicans who shared common political and social views concerning the liberation of slaves, the abolition of slave trade, and the reform of the penal system, amongst other issues, and who worked laboriously towards these ends over many years, motivated by their Christian faith and concern for social justice and fairness for all.
The group centered on the Church of John Venn, rector of Clapham in South London. Many were members of parliament where, in addition to their abolitionism, they worked for prison reform, prevention of cruel sports, and the suspension of the game laws and the lottery. The key personalities were William Wilberforce, Henry Thornton, James Stephen, and Dacre Macaulay.
William Wilberforce, 1759 to 1833, was a key member of the Clapham sect and a leading abolitionist, philanthropist, and an MP. He challenged the attitudes of the social and political elites by advocating for social responsibility and putting faith into action. Charles Grant, 1746 to 1823, acquired a large fortune through silk manufacture in Malda, India, and became a director of the British East India Company, 1794 to 1816. With Wilberforce, he wanted to spread education and Christianity in India alongside the company's commercial interests. He has helped establish the Sierra Leone Company, which created a colony for freed slaves.
Granville Sharp, 1735 to 1830, was a scholar who campaigned for social justice. In 1787, with his fellow Anglican Thomas Clarkson and a group of Quakers, Sharp founded the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Sharp supported the resettlement of British and Canadian slaves to Sierra Leone, but despite reports about its moral decline and the resurgence of slave trading in the colony, maintained the view that the project was worthwhile. Henry Venn was the founder of the Clapham Group. He was curate at Holy Trinity in 1754, and his son John became rector 1792 to 1813. Wilberforce and Henry Thornton, two of the group's most influential leaders, resided nearby, and many of the meetings were held in their houses. They were encouraged by Bibli Porteous, the Bishop of London himself, an abolitionist and reformer who sympathized with many of their aims.
Methods and accomplishments. After many decades of work, both in the British sector and in Parliament, the reformers saw their efforts rewarded with the final passage of the Slave Trade Act in 1807, banning the trade throughout the British Empire, and after many years of campaigning the total emancipation of British slaves with the passing of the Slavery Abolition Act 1833. They also campaigned vigorously for Britain to use its influence to work towards abolishing slavery throughout the world. It's a new slide.
Some of the group Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, and William Wilberforce were responsible for the founding in 1787 of Sierra Leone as a settlement for some of the African Americans freed by the British during the American Revolutionary War. It thus became the first major British colony in Africa, whose purpose, in Clarkson's words, was the abolition of the slave trade, the civilization of Africa, and the introduction of the gospel there. Later in 1792, another of the group, John Clarkson, was instrumental in the creation of its capital, Freetown.
The group are described by many historians, Stephen Tompkins, as a network of friends and families in England with William Wilberforce as its center of gravity, who were powerfully bound together by their shared moral and spiritual values, by their religious mission and social activism, by their love for each other, and by marriage. By 1848, when evangelical Bishop John Bird Sumner became Archbishop of Canterbury, it is said that between a quarter and a third of Anglican clergy were linked to the movement. By then had diversified greatly in its goals, although they were no longer considered an organized faction. There's other societies that members of the group founded or were involved with included the Anti-Slavery Society, the Abolition Society, the Proclamation Society, the Sunday School Society, the Veteran Society, and the Small Debt Society.
The Camp Ham Sex campaign succeeded, and here's the lesson. Not because of one celebrity, but because of close work. All the Clanfahites were involved in gathering vital evidence against the trade of Parliament and lobbying for abolition. All took part in persuading the nation. Without Thomas Clarkson's indefatigable labors, Henry Thornton's devoted wealth and astuteness, Zachary Macaulay's courage and vigor, Thomas Babington's care of Wilberforce and Maclay, and James Stephen's legal acumen, the sect could not have succeeded. Nor was this teamwork only a matter of words. In 1791, the Wilberforce lost his first Commons motion. Wilberforce, Granville Sharp, Henry Thornton, Lord Teignmouth, Charles Grant, Thomas Barnabas, and others combined to launch the Sierra Leone Company, as was mentioned before. That African project was far bigger than one man. Now we're on to the Society for Gradual Abolition of Slavery. Callie can read now.
The first was founded in 1823 and was committed to the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. Its official name was the Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery throughout the British Dominions. This objective was achieved in 1838 under the terms of the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. Under the terms of the abolition of the Slave Trade Act in 1807, British captains who were caught continuing the trade were fined £100 for each slave found on board. However, this law did not stop the British slave trade. If slave ships were in danger of being captured by the British Navy, captains often reduced the fines they had to pay by ordering the slaves to be thrown into the sea.
Some people involved in the anti-slave trade campaign, such as argued that the only way to end the suffering of the slave was to make slavery illegal. William Wilberforce disagreed. He believed that he believed that at this time, slaves were not ready to be granted their freedom. The key personalities who were invested in this cause are Thomas Clarkson, Granville Sharp, James Cropper, Samuel Romilly, Joseph Sturge, Thomas Fowell Buxton, William Allen, and Zachary Macaulay.
The Anti-Slavery Society called for the adoption of measures to improve slave conditions in the British West Indies, together with a plan for gradual emancipation that would ultimately lead to complete freedom.
The Anti-Slavery Society was a national organization. Large numbers of women were also involved in the movement. It is estimated that at least 70 women's associations were active between 1825 and 1833. Between 1828 and 1833, when slavery was finally abolished in the British West Indies, Parliament was deluged by over 5,000 petitions against colonial slavery organized by the Anti-Slavery Society and signed by 1.5 million Britons. The National Female Petition of 1833 contained 187,157 signatures, making it the largest single anti-slavery petition ever to be presented to Parliament.
In 1823, Cropper wrote to Zachary Macaulay suggesting the formation of a new abolition society. Later that year, James Cropper, Thomas Clarkson, Samuel Romilly, Joseph Sturge, Thomas Fowell Buxton, William Allen, and Zachary Macaulay to form the Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery. Clarkson agreed to take the road again to resurrect the old abolition network of some 70 local bodies and to establish new ones. Cropper offered Clarkson £500 to pay for the campaign.
In his book, The Great White Lie, 1973, Jack Grattis argues the plan was to divide the country into districts and to send a lecturer to each, armed with facts and information about slavery, and fired by an enthusiasm to convert new audiences around the country to emancipation. The Quakers accepted the idea immediately, and Cropper advanced £500 out of his own pocket, mentioned before. The prosperous Birmingham Quaker, Joseph Sturge, who was to play such an important role in the later history of emancipation, advanced £250. Wilberforce gave £20, and James Stephens 10 guineas.
In 1823, George Canning, as Foreign Secretary, introduced a series of resolutions calling for the amelioration of the condition of the slave population in His Majesty's colonies. These were followed in 1824 by an order in council for improving the condition of slaves in Trinidad and later other crown colonies. The order made provision for a number of important reforms: encouragement of formal marriage, abolition of the use of the whip in the fields, greater attention to religious instruction, rights of slaves to purchase their own freedom, appointment of an independent slave protector whose job it was to provide official returns of births, deaths, marriages, punishments, and
Manumissions.
and
Sorry that you can
manumission.
see.
In 1931, some of the anti-slavery society's more radical elements formed the Agency Committee and committed to a much more radical and far-reaching agenda, namely to immediate and unconditional abolition of slavery. The first reformed parliament after 1832 was sympathetic to emancipation. In May 1833, Lord Stanley presented a plan to Parliament which finally passed into law on August the 29th. The 1833 Act provided the gradual abolition of slavery in the British West Indies. Under its terms, everyone over the age of 6 on 1st of August 1834, when the law went into effect, was required to serve an apprenticeship of between 4 and 6 years, except in Antigua or the Bahamas, which both passed local legislation abolitioning
apprenticeship, the new legislation awarded colonial planters £20 million in compensation.
Abolitionists were disappointed with the gradual approach to emancipation. They therefore exposed what they saw as the failings of the apprenticeship system and succeeded in bringing an early end to apprenticeship. Between May and August 1838, all of the colonies passed legislation ending apprenticeship on the 1st of August 1838, which is why this date and not 1834 is traditionally recognized in the British Caribbean as the anniversary of the ending of slavery. Arguments against slavery. Sir, when I was reading Kenna's presentation, like basically every single point that Kenna had,
Yes, I
we had them
completely
as well,
agree. So,
like
ladies,
cut up and
yes,
everything.
yes, Thorpe, and time is against us. I have 2 more classes after this. So, thank you very much. Very informative presentation. Tomorrow, when we meet, ladies, we will do the French abolition. All right, we're going to look at French emancipation. We're going to start French emancipation tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of the day.
You want the presentation so that you can post them on Google Classroom?
Yes, you can email me the presentations.
Okay,
Sir, so we're not going to do presentations, the other groups.
Which group did not present?
Us about Joseph Sturge and so on. Sir, we had sent you the presentation, but I guess you forgot that.
That is
Wait.
Osborne group?
Yes, sir.
All right, so tomorrow morning you present. Tomorrow when we meet, you for the first 15 minutes,
Yes,
I'll
sir.
do that presentation.
Okay, sir.
All right.